Hey, we're live. My name's Andy. I'm here with our ops team for Basecamp. They handle operations. We're going to jump right in. We're talking today about what it was like to roll out Hey. We're talking about a job opening, and then at the end, we'll take your questions. So save them up. We are across YouTube, Periscope, and Twitch right now. So you can ask questions at any one of those. We'll do our best to get to them. So take it away, fellas.
Hey, Andy, thanks a lot. Well, it's kind of great to be back. Got the whole, the same Blake and Nathan who were on the last stream, and then John who joined us this time as well. So anyway, it's excited to have everybody there. I think today we'll talk a little bit about the Hey launch. That was certainly a thing that's taken a lot from a lot of us. Before we do that, I'll do a little commercial too, as we're looking at growing our team out to add 2 or 3 more folks to help with some of the work around Hey. Both some of the current work as well as some of the future work around custom domains and Hey for Work and all the other products that we have here. So we'll certainly be happy to take any questions about the application process, which closes out on Sunday, and about that part of the environment. But, I know I don't speak for the rest of you, but I know I was talking to Nathan on Friday, and I felt like I was still kind of from having the Hey launch hangover. This is kind of the first week where I've started to feel a little bit more back to normal. But, Blake, I'm going to start with you just because you probably kind of dove into the very earliest part of the Hey infrastructure, have the longest history with that up to launch. Yeah, tell us a little bit about what the launch was like for you and a little bit about that journey. And then maybe we'll get hear a little bit more from Nathan and John too.
I think launching Hey was very satisfying. It went a lot smoother than I expected. It's always nice to see infrastructure that you spend a lot of time on hold up to scaling faster than you expect and larger than you expect. Like we certainly didn't plan for the traffic that we ended up getting. I think our estimates were like, oh, okay, maybe we'll see this in 6 months, but no, it actually happened over 2 weeks. It was a significantly faster ramp than we expected. Everything held up, nothing fell apart, nothing caught fire, which was really nice to see. I was really happy.
Yeah, I think it was, for me, it was a little bit of, if you'd have told me what we were going to go through right before the launch, and then I'd have looked at how well it went, I would have just been ecstatic. But I think at the same time, we're looking at a lot left over, a lot of cleanup work to do, and a lot of things that we've learned from the first few weeks of Hey. But Nathan, I know we were both talking about some of that exhaustion too through the process. But what were your thoughts about going through that?
So initially, when we were talking about the Hey launch, we were, we had our infrastructure in place. We were a little bit, confident that, okay, if we do a slow rollout, we're going to be fine. We'll be able to see all these, problems telegraphed well in advance. We'll be able to do some quick performance testing and scalability, capacity estimation, get things moved up in a nice, orderly fashion. And then that plan just kind of went right out the window as interest in Hey just, skyrocketed. There was all of a sudden a lot of pressure that I'm ecstatic that it went so well. But at the same time, it was also draining, emotionally. It was, getting up every day and wondering, okay, when we double our numbers today, what's this whole day going to look like? How much time am I going to spend on a call, trying to troubleshoot an issue that we didn't think was going to be a problem because we didn't see it in our load testing, which was something that was a little, I don't know, say irritating, but a little perplexing. Whereas when we thought we were load testing something, the system under actual load was significantly different behavior-wise. So it's definitely prompted some lessons on, how are we load testing and are we load testing the right things?
I think a lot of that showed too that like the way that we dog food things internally doesn't necessarily match up with how folks outside of the circle will use it, because we know what we're designing the product for and what goals we're trying to hit. And so we internally may be using the product to the best of its abilities, but when we give it to the public, it's like, well, you may not know about all these little things that we've hidden in here that may be resource intensive on the back end that you're not hitting. And so while we're testing all of this stuff, the flows of our testing flows don't necessarily match up with what we saw customers using it as.
Yeah, there's no substitution for real live production traffic for load testing. That's always the best.
Yeah. Hey, John, does anything kind of stand out at you as a surprise from, I know you were in some of the earliest load testing work that we did way back in sort of February and March. Is there anything about the real world that surprised you in particular? And if you're having trouble thinking of something, maybe I'll say the word, bays to you, but there's probably a few others too.
Yeah, so that certainly brings up a good one. So in our mail stack, we use RSpamD and Clam AV as kind of our spam and antivirus protection for Hey. And RSpamD is a wonderful piece of software as long as you don't need to dive too far into it. And of course, even through load testing, we saw certainly some performance issues with the Redis integration with the Bayesian statistics feature that RSpamD has, and it only got worse as we launched into production, even worse than what we saw in our load testing. So that was certainly surprising and a little stressful, and it's still a little stressful even today.
Yeah, we were battling that just this morning again, where we saw a big spike on that cluster of Redis nodes.
Yep, and we've tried a few solutions for it, and nothing seems to really be fixing the CPU. And then we're also, in that same regard, we're kind of hamstrung by AWS and only being able to have 5 replica nodes for our Elasticache clusters. So I guess the one option there is to move to Elasticache, or Redis cluster or something like that. But we haven't dove that far into it yet. So
yeah, it's on that long list of work left to be done, I think, that's out there in front of us. But so I know, Blake, around the time of the launch, you'd gotten a lot of questions about sort of the stack. Maybe you could just do a quick overview of what the technology stack that we looks like. And then in particular, I know there's been some discussion about Vitess, which we can kind of come back to as well, and where that fits, or maybe where that fits in the future. But maybe just to answer some of those questions, do a quick overview on what the stack looks like.
Yeah, so Hey is running on AWS using a bunch of AWS managed services, because our view is that while they do cost extra money, the value that we gain out of not having to handhold those services through failovers and maintenance and everything is worth it. So on the compute side, the app is sitting on top of AWS's Elastic Kubernetes Service, EKS. We started development with the app in GKE, ended up moving it over to AWS a couple months in. It's been great. EKS has been pretty good. It's got some flaws, but overall the product looks really good now compared to what it did 2 years ago when it was launched. We run Puma and, Puma. We run Puma is the rack server for the app, and it's fronted by OpenResty/Nginx with ALBs sitting in front of that. And then on the mail-in side, we use classic ELBs with hopefully soon to switch over to network load balancers. Hitting RSpamD and Postfix and ClamAV sitting in a similar kind of Kubernetes cluster setup. We also run backend asynchronous jobs with Rescue, and all of this stuff is talking to Redis servers that are in Elasticache and MySQL databases that are currently running in Aurora, and AWS is a managed Elasticsearch service. So I think that's all the big pieces.
Yeah, and I think there's been some talk about Vitess, and it's certainly in our future plans. It's actually, I think, one of the big projects ahead of us is sort of moving around towards that technology in the future as a way to scale up the platform. So it wasn't something that we required for launch, but it definitely was something that's important to our future as we expand out and kind of grow things too. And some of the work that we'll be doing down the road. Just looking over at some of the comments, I didn't realize until we were jumping into this that we're running right up against the congressional, topic of antitrust, which, I don't know whether there'll be people out there looking for a break who come over to listen to what we're talking about, or who will have no interest in this compared to, somebody questioning the big boys in tech. But I think that was, certainly another big thing that you can listen to the rework. The latest rework episode talks a lot about our showdown with Apple, which probably hit us less from the ops side in particular, but it was certainly pretty dramatic and a lot of stress, I think, that added to the whole launch week phase. Although, I will say, just to kind of build on Nathan's comments earlier, in the fall when not too long after I got here, there was all this talk about, we were going to add 100 customers a day for the first week of pay. And I think when we got into sort of load testing and discussions in February, there was this, hey, we should look at what it would take to have 50,000 users on the system in the first month of launch, with a long-term goal of 250,000. And I think, first of all, we launch into the week of actually the Hey launch, and I think we have over 50,000 people on the sign-up list. And by the time the Apple made all that noise, I think the number was well over 100,000 by the time we got to the end of the week. And for me, it was getting that Saturday call from David going, well, we got some good news. Apple's blinked, and we have a plan to go forward with the app, and that's going to get resolved. But the downside is we basically have to open this up to the public on Wednesday, which meant that our 250,000 user target was no longer long-term in the future, but could be as short as a week. And I think at one point we were well over 100,000 users on the system. So that, I will say that was stress-inducing, although I'm really proud of the way the infrastructure held up. And I think, Nathan you talked about the missing aspects of the load testing, but I also think, man, without that load testing work that we did, I don't know how I would have, taken that phone call on Saturday and not probably gone into complete meltdown, because I felt like, while we didn't know everything, we certainly knew a lot about the characteristics of our system and the performance that was there. And that made it a lot easier.
Yeah. The load testing, while it wasn't perfect, it was still sufficient, right? We still were able to uncover many slow queries and hotspots in the app that we're able to, basically take back to the developers and say, we need some more optimization on these. As soon as we get more than, say, 30 replies in a message thread, this really slows down. We need to do better here. And they made some serious performance gains, and that was critical. That was absolutely critical. I know John and Blake were both more involved in some of the load testing than I was, so I can let them speak to like our performance targets and what we were looking for and all that stuff.
One comment that about kind of launch week, and something that was slightly humorous and something that we totally didn't expect and didn't load test for, was the result of sending out invites in groups of 10,000, and how different mail services see that as being spam, or so
mildly abusive.
Yeah, mildly abusive. So we had to slow our roll a little bit there, and after the first time of doing that, which was not something that we expected, but something we, in hindsight, probably should have considered a little bit more.
Yeah, but it was pretty fascinating, because I had set up a lot of the monitoring tools to sort of follow the various email services that we use to see how our systems were being viewed. And one of the first spam reports I got, I think, from one of the Microsoft services, was an example of our invite of why our domain was thought of sending spam. And backpedaling on that was a quick learning lesson. I think it's good news we could do it fairly quickly. But that was like, we're hurting ourselves. Self-induced pain that was certainly not expected. So let's see a couple of questions that were coming in over the live stream. So there's a question here about, is the end goal to move Basecamp's infra to on-prem and have more control, or continue to use AWS for scalability? I would say there's not a goal. We are pretty active in using both on-prem resources and cloud resources where they feel like they fit. Even if you look at Hey, to get more control over some of our IPs and pieces, a lot of our outbound mail relays sit on-prem. Some of our Prometheus infrastructure we're putting around on-prem. And we have even our databases replicated on-prem in case we need to have them there. While the bulk of stuff runs in the cloud, I think it will, as long as we're in this pretty dynamic environment. And we like having that flexibility of putting things where it makes the most sense from a reliability and cost standpoint. And so we like being able to move things. I mean, obviously, you're not moving things on a day-to-day basis. But I think as we see things that make sense on-prem, we'll put them there. We have that option of putting them in on-prem. But, for one, I'm glad we weren't launching Hey on-prem. I don't know how we'd have dealt with the completely chaotic timeline that we had, at least in terms of the shift from what was anticipated to what was used in the end. And that was, I think, pretty critical. So we also had a question about, I guess, kind of like what's the ops work life environment like at Basecamp? Obviously, things have been a little bit out of the norm the last few weeks, but Blake, how do you think about the just what the pace of work in ops at Basecamp is, what it has been? I can maybe talk a little bit about where it's going, but why don't you take that as a starter?
Yeah, really over the last year and a half, I've kind of been siloed on Hey work through nobody's fault of my own. It hasn't really been bad. It's been a lot of fun to see this product through from right when we started development and the first work that is around getting infrastructure set up for it and how are we going to deploy it, how do we want to manage it, all the way through now. And really outside of the maybe month or two leading up to launch, things were relatively calm. And even leading up to launch, it was still 40-hour weeks. There wasn't anything wild going on. The COVID-19 stuff made life generally more stressful. And it still is now, even with all of our very large post-launch to-do lists and things that we want to go back and pick up. And then at the same time, try not to leave other products in the dust because we are a small team and we do have a lot of different products that we have our hands on and things that we need to manage. But I think it's been pretty good. I openly admitted early on a couple months ago that I was getting kind of burnt out working on one product for so long straight and not really getting to see the light of anything else. And I spent a couple weeks working on some other stuff that we have in AWS, and that kind of gave me the refresher that I needed. But it's been pretty good. I've really enjoyed working on this, and even before I started working on Hey, just the general feel that our team has and the way we work and the way that we work together.
Yeah, John, I think you're a decade now that you've been doing this at Basecamp? How does this sort of fit into your 10 years and how you think about your experience overall here?
I think the Hey launch certainly was the most stressful launch that I have been a part of, and that includes Basecamp 3, Basecamp 2, a high-rise refresh, and then a couple other smaller launches. It certainly was the most stressful, but I also think it was also the launch that was kind of most out of our normal wheelhouse. It was a new product. It's not a new version of Basecamp. So I think some of that was kind of expected. But overall, I think that it ratcheted up pretty quickly, and then I think it's ratcheting down now pretty quickly too. So it's
there were so many different facets of new in there too. It was more than just typically we make products aimed at businesses. And this is not a product aimed at business. It was not launched on infrastructure the way that we typically operate it. It was on newer versions of software. Everything was new.
Well, right? I think
it made everything so much different.
Well, you add in just the complexity of having to deal with email abuse and spam and deliverability and inbound versus outbound. And even the domain, along with all the technologies, I think that's one of the reasons I look back and think if you'd have told me it would have gone this well, I would have been ecstatic, even though I'm a little overwhelmed at all the stuff that still exists. Because, the number of unknowns, at least for me, and I think really none of us have, an extensive history running consumer email platforms. Not that many people do, and I do think we had a lot of experience with email at scale with Basecamp but that was very transactional. Volume email versus what we've seen. And, I know the first time, like, we'd start getting reports about why is this going to spam? And it would be like, I felt like I had about 10 years worth of spam education in about a week and a half. And certainly a lot more to learn, a lot more to do. But that was both exciting and, I think terrifying and, ultimately gratifying that it's gone as well as it has to this point. So, and I certainly know a lot more about email bombs and the evils of WordPress in that world than I did when I started. So that's been quite something. So we had another question come in about our monitoring pipeline, and maybe I'll flip that over to Nathan to talk about that and logging too, because I think those were some areas we did a lot of work and a lot of different tools in this environment. So maybe
there's a lot of new tooling when it comes to our Hey infrastructure as far as logging and monitoring. The monitoring stuff for Hey is primarily done through Prometheus. We're feeding the Kubernetes exporters, Node exporters. We've got Redis exporters. Those are all feeding data into Prometheus, which two of our other guys, Aaron and Matthew, they've been the primary drivers behind those. But that's most of the monitoring. We still have a couple Hey checks in our Nagios setup, our legacy Nagios setup, if you will. But we also have a new logging pipeline, and we're using primarily FileBeat and Logstash, Kibana, Elasticsearch, the Elk pipeline. And for the most part, I'm really pretty happy with it. There's been a lot of learning curve getting things solid and steady the way we want them to. But it's pretty flexible. We're running FileBeat on every single node in our clusters through a daemon set that are sending to a Logstash deployment that then parses all of those and sends them on to our Kibana servers. We also are sending those out to BigQuery. We're streaming some of that data straight over into BigQuery for some analytic long-term stuff. And I just found out, was it today, that was a whole lot cheaper than what I thought it was. I think it's like something like $3 a day for our BigQuery stuff, which was very, very nice. I can tell you right now, the Elasticsearch is definitely not $3 a day. So, yeah. But so far it's been a pretty flexible pipeline. We've been able to add things to it, handle the processing of different messages, and structure the data very, very flexibly, and make changes on the fly, which is really nice. So.
Well, I think that's been, another aspect of this. David talked a little bit about in some of the podcasts we've done about this, about how building something new has given us a chance to get some technologies that eventually we can flow into other platforms. And, we're already taking some of the structured logging platform stuff and beginning to move it into some of our older apps. I know we're starting to look at how Kubernetes can become a platform, for future, even for some of the existing platforms, so that we get more consistency there. And certainly MySQL with Vitess, I think, has a long future with us as we think about how to use this new product to explore some things that ultimately allow us to flow back into the other pieces that we're doing at the rate that we can. I think that is one of the things about the ops environment at Basecamp, having been here just short of a year now, is we do have a lot of old products and a lot of technologies that, we don't have the ability to go back and port everything to. So we have to be kind of smart about where we move things, where we get consistency and where we sort of leave legacy, which is kind of this trade-off that I think we struggle with consistently about, where is it worth upgrading for consistency, and where are we kind of putting effort into a product that's on its way out. And so we do have to work through that quite a bit. I wanted to acknowledge one other question that popped up here about the interview process. So just to talk a little bit about the hiring process at Basecamp. So we have an open period now where we're accepting applications. So that process will go on through Sunday. I would put a word out that says that, the application process of Basecamp is really important. I mean, we are an entirely remote group. We put a lot of emphasis on written communication. Your first chance to introduce yourselves as a potential coworker to us is in that application letter and in the answer to some of the questions that we have there. So I would encourage people to take time to put some thought into that and to think about how the writing reflects about how they communicate in written form. Because while we're all here and we do a lot of video meetings, we mostly communicate through Basecamp and through the tools and through written communication. And so that becomes a big filter for how we think about whether people will plug into what we're doing. I think the other, from that point, we'll filter it down to a list of folks that we'll start to look at more closely. We do a practical problem that, I think we're going to try to aim that at it's kind of an 8 hours of work type of thing where we can actually see how you approach infrastructure type work that will be done to a small group of people, probably, less than a couple dozen folks that will sort of participate in that. And then from that, we'll sort of filter it down to some interviews. I expect, as it was answered, that some of the people here will be involved in those interviews. I know typically we've done those in more group form. And so there'll probably be a couple of different passes with some folks here at Basecamp where we'll do some in-person, virtual in-person interviews over video. And, we'll look at everything from kind of, how well you'll, just sort of your approach and sort of culture fit is. Where we'll have probably some of our HR people involved in that discussion, all the way into sort of looking at where you might have some technical ability to fit into some specific work projects that we have. And then I would also say just flexibility, because we do cover a wide range of territory. So we don't have a lot of, we don't have like a person who's the database administrator. Everybody sort of touches the database. Everybody touches Kubernetes, and everybody gets a chance to go back and work with RE 1.8.7 on some of our older apps. It's just the nature of where we are. So that flexibility, I think, is an important part. And I may actually have one of the few laptops in existence that has a working version of RE 1.8.7. So it can be done. So anyway, let's see. Let's come back to some of the other questions. Let's look quickly. Nathan, just to pick up on the monitoring, since this was a follow-up question, but CloudWatch, where do we use or not use CloudWatch, and how do we feel about CloudWatch? I know you see.
Yeah, we use CloudWatch a lot, actually. So CloudWatch is a fantastic tool. Apologies, my dog's outside.
No problem.
It's a great tool, but you take a hit every time you pull metrics out. It costs money. So if we can reduce our reliance on that, it ends up saving us money in the long term.
Well,
and it's also
that 2-minute lag, at least to getting them into Prometheus. And for us, I think that while CloudWatch is a source, it's insufficient to be everything for us, particularly as we integrate across environments. So, I think all of those points are reasons that CloudWatch has not been sufficient, although it is an element.
I have this Cloud Spinzar hat here to also point out that it is also incredibly expensive. All of the CloudWatch, like the things under the CloudWatch umbrella, at scale, they're not cheap, especially like CloudWatch logging. I know I've seen a lot of people ask, like, why don't you just use CloudWatch logs? Why are you running your own log pipeline? And it's because CloudWatch logs is super expensive at scale. And it's just like not worth paying for at that price.
So somebody, let's see, there's another thing here about having a cloud account. So for the purposes of the interviewing process, if we do an exercise where we ask some people to do some work, we will make sure that you do not have to have your own resources or sort of spend your own money on doing that. So we want this to be accessible to anybody who's in the process. In fact, I would say that's an aspect of this process in general, is we want this to be as wide open as possible. I know in a lot of places I've been, hiring for these kinds of jobs goes through a network and people talk to friends of friends, and that's how you find candidates. I can tell you that the only candidates we're considering for this are people that are coming in through the standard interview process that everybody is open to participate in. And we certainly will make sure that everybody in that process has equal access to the resources to be successful with the problem work and the other pieces that are through there. So that shouldn't be something that you would need to be concerned about. So Blake, what kinds of metrics are we watching from a scaling standpoint to kind of know how we're doing?
I think response time is a big one. We have SLOs. Is that the right one? I can never remember if it's SLOs or SLOs. Yeah, it must be SLOs. SLOs we watch a lot. P50, P99, P95. And ideally we want to see 100 milliseconds, I think is our internal SLO on for P50. And so that one gets paid pretty close attention to. If we're spiking above that, then we should do what we can to alleviate it via horizontal scaling. And with other versions of Basecamp, we've leaned a lot on vertical scaling. We have a lot of pretty high-powered servers that handle compute, but we don't scale them very wide per data center. And on this app, we went a different approach and took a more horizontal scaling ability, or that sentence doesn't make sense, but it's there. I think for Hey at peak, we were running pods across like 100 nodes in AWS, which like isn't a ton, but 100 is different from like 20 that we run on prem for something like Basecamp 3. So yeah, I think response time is a big one.
And on the email side, like email ingestion and email sending, we also keep track of kind of some SLOs on that side on how many seconds it takes for an email from the time someone sends it, or the time we receive it to the time it's in someone's inbox. And so that includes, the whole pipeline of spam and antivirus and postfix and all the other background jobs that it goes through to get into someone's inbox. So
yeah, we also do outbound monitoring of sending emails to make sure that they're making it out of our system in a timely fashion and arriving in people's inboxes. So that we can detect deliverability issues and get kind of a early warning system that a provider might not be happy with what we've been doing.
Yeah, and for inbound mail, we also track pipeline latency from the point that the mail first hits postfix until it lands in the user inbox. And if that goes above a certain threshold, it alerts and wakes up whoever's on call to go dig into it.
Let's see. Other question popped up. Do we tend to meet people through networks or meetups or go through agencies? I'll go back again and what I said before is this is all about people that apply to our job posting. So we're not, we don't do, unlike some companies where I've been at, we don't do a lot of active recruiting in the sense of like we go out and find recruiters and go through sort of standard networking. We're blessed, I think, with a pretty large presence. People that follow David and Jason, but Basecamp and the history of people, and we've been able to, at least to advertise our openings with the posts on SVN, and typically gotten a great pool of candidates that have come in response to those jobs postings. So that's our preferred approach, and that's what we're taking here. So there's no secret network to get in. If you want to be considered, write a great application, share your information with us through the links that are available on the SVN post. And if you have any questions, I'm sure any of us here would be happy to provide some additional guidance around that. But it's really that straightforward. I
had a private question from somebody who asked when ops team folks were going to move out of Eastern and Central time zone so that they could apply. So am I allowed to move to Hawaii? Is this my formal permission for that?
I don't know. My head's still spinning from the number of different places you've told me you want to move to. And
I thought you were moving to New Zealand.
I think you have. Yeah, you always have permission. I think.
Unfortunately, nobody wants us right now, so we're kind of stuck here.
Yeah. Well, there is that whole thing about moving anywhere right now.
Yeah.
I think that's always a challenge. So let's see, scrolling through the other questions. Let's see, what cloud providers are we using? So we do have some infrastructure in Google Cloud Platform, which Nathan sort of mentioned. Really, some of our analytics componentry is over there. We did have some other applications in GCP a long history ago that I don't really want to cover, but it didn't go so well for a variety of reasons, from how it was deployed to things that went on inside of Google Cloud. And so we don't have any of our actual, what I would call mission critical apps running in Google right now, but we do use their analytics infrastructure for that. I will say that we are happily not using Google for email anymore. We are the first company on Hey for Work, which is where all of our business email goes through. And it'll be exciting to see more people get to see some of the interesting aspects of that as that moves towards a more generalized product in the future. I think that's mostly it from a cloud standpoint. We've had some discussions about diversifying out. Some of you might not be surprised to know that my boss, this DHH, has an interest in maybe not being wed to big tech as a long-term future. And so there's been some interest in how we might be able to vary who some of our suppliers are and how we sort of move away from some of the big players. But I think we also realize that running an app at scale requires some infrastructure that isn't available from everywhere. And AWS has certainly met our needs for Hey. I think we're pretty happy with that as well. So we'll see where that goes in the long term. But right now it's really primarily AWS for cloud with some also support from GCP. Let's
really quickly, I just want to interject. Someone asked about on-prem testing versus AWS testing. All of our testing was done in AWS at a much higher scale than what we were currently running Haystack at. We had scaled it up basically to be a full, this is what we would be running in production environment with the massive Aurora databases, the massive Redis instances, the very widely scaled deployments for Kubernetes. So it was a very full featured end-to-end testing environment.
I saw some questions on how we actually were doing that testing. We were using crafted JMeter configs based on data that I had pulled out of how we had been using the app in like a dog feeding mode over the last 30 days, and kind of like put together a testing plan based on that really hit all of the pieces of the app, everything from mail in to mail out, asynchronous jobs, Elasticsearch, loading pages that we knew were highly resource intensive in the app. So we were using JMeter running on actually a bunch of AWS workspaces because during this load testing, we were pushing like 1.2, 1.3 gigabits per second of traffic out of these workspaces, and not everybody on the team has gigabit internet, so it's not super feasible to do from your own laptop. So
that was a humble brag, I'm pretty sure.
No problem. You can't see the wire that's slightly off screen running out my door right now because my Wi-Fi's awful.
Let's see. So in terms of determining the SLOs, really that, everything at Basecamp really starts with user experience. I think one of the things, somebody who's relatively new here, the designers have a massive influence and user experience. It really drives almost everything that we do at Basecamp. And so really what starts everything is what do users expect from the system in terms of response time for load pages, in terms of how quickly email gets in and out of the system. Was really all driven by that, which eventually gets translated into much more technical specs. There are no consequences to missed targets in terms of, we're a 50-person company, so we don't have like chargebacks and, big budget aspects for things. Obviously the consequences are we know we're not meeting our customer obligations, and we assume that will reflect in customer loyalty. So we take all that extremely seriously. But, it's not like we're in some place where, like I've got an SLO budget and, my pay gets docked if ops misses something. It's not, we're not quite that draconian about it. But we do monitor it very carefully, and it's something we take that's very important. Incident response and incident analysis. I'll start with that, I guess, because I've spent a fair amount of time on that. So we have from a response standpoint, we have somebody on call all the time. Somebody from the ops team is the primary on call. We run kind of every week has two shifts. There's sort of a Monday morning to Friday morning shift, which is kind of the week shift, and then a weekend. So we split that up so that not everybody has a whole week. So you're usually either covering during the week or of the weekend. We try to pick up some in off hours. So, our anybody that's in Europe might pick up early morning if they have some free time to help somebody sleep. Same thing in the West Coast. We'll pick up sometimes later in the evening or offset. Somebody in Europe is on call. But So that person's on response. We have a certain number of alerts that like sort of system down scenarios that will trigger actually the entire ops team. We call those kind of our code red alerts, where we something goes off that indicates a more serious problem that will kind of page everybody at once. We also have a mechanism that can then raise that page to everybody in the company. So in the event of serious incidents, we essentially have a one button process. I think of it as the big red button we can push and notify the entire company 24 hours a day of a bigger issue if we need to get our support or development or other teams sort of escalated into things. Thankfully we don't have to use that often, but that process is there. We actually test that process once a month. Actually, John pulls the trigger or makes somebody pull the trigger once a month to make sure that everybody gets the notifications and knows how to get to the right Zoom channels and the right communications vehicles. So, that's something we don't just write down. We actually make sure it works. And then the post-incident analysis, we write up incident reports for every incident that we have. We have an internal deadline to try to get an incident report up within 2 hours of the beginning of an incident. We continue to evolve that as we dive deep into learnings and continue to kind of flesh things out over time. And then there's an action item list that gets generated out of each one of those that we track, and all that's tracked inside of a Basecamp project for incidents. So that's the high level view. I think, we try to do a lot of, sort of a mix. We obviously do some immediate kind of learning and response stuff, but I think we try to go pretty deep in understanding, what led to failures, what behavioral changes, what blind spots those create, and sort of go beyond just the tactical, like, oh, we missed this monitoring piece, or oh, we missed that other part. But think a little bit more extensively about that. And maybe John, I should have turned this over to you earlier, but you are kind of our lead on operational preparedness. And this is sort of a big initiative that we've launched you into over the last few months. But talk a little bit more broadly about how we think about getting ready, or maybe even really about incident prevention with response.
Yeah, so I think probably one of the biggest tools we have to prepare for the inevitable incidents whenever they do come is fire drilling. And so that could be, like Troy just mentioned, fire drilling actually getting a hold of people. That could also be fire drilling the tooling that we have. So fire drilling our tooling around MySQL for if a MySQL primary database goes down. The fire drilling our multi-region scripting that we have for our on-prem apps. So fire drilling, I think, is probably the biggest tool we have to prepare ourselves for these incidents. And fire drilling doesn't always have to be in production. It could also be in our staging environments, and just making sure that everyone on our team knows how these tools work and is ready to use those tools whenever there is a production incident. And I think that's something that we're getting better at over time. And that was one of the goals whenever I kind of started down this operational preparedness path a few months ago, was to make sure that when there are incidents that we can act faster and be more effective, and be ready for them when they do happen, because shit breaks. It's just, it's inevitable. And we can make it better, or we can sometimes make it worse. So I think fire drilling helps us to make things better. So,
well, I think you brought up an important point. Well, it doesn't have to be in production. We do this in production. Like we don't just assume our tooling works or have a drill plan, but we will actually, take Basecamp 3 and run it out of our other data center for a period of time and flip it back periodically to make sure that it's more than just an idea or a run book, but something that we can verify. And then we enhance and evolve over time. And I think that's been really, really great for us. We don't, just to get to one quick question, we don't currently have sort of what I call the chaos monkey, which I think of like more randomly throwing errors into the system to see how it responds to. That's not something we've done. We have looked at some more automated tooling to be able to simulate and trigger failures, and something that I think we're interested in doing more of in the future. But it's also something we're approaching very carefully in our actual environment. We have done a little bit with it in staging, and I think in this idea of sort of testing and drilling, it might have some, particularly for triggering staging outages and other things, some things. And we may get more confident in our ability to have some of this running in production too. But it's not something that we actively do now, but it's definitely something we're paying attention to. And I think maybe this got picked up on, but our big red button is powered by PagerDuty. I don't know if like we should have a branding. I should get a discount for that, for saying that. But anyway, I don't know.
I think on the Chaos Monkey question, I think it's worth pointing out that the front end of Hey actually runs a vast majority of the compute is on Spot instances. So we do have like somewhat of a forced Chaos Monkey
like
workload in there.
An institutional Chaos Monkey, if you will.
Yeah, which is a vast departure from how we run other apps, both on-prem and other things that we run on AWS. So we have had to put a decent chunk of work into Hey to make it behave properly with Spot instances in the mix.
I think, or as I like to say, just running in the cloud is our Chaos Monkey.
And I think it's another thing. Another point about Chaos Monkey is, as good of a tool as it is. It was built for very large infrastructures with very large teams, and for a very hands-on small team, Chaos Monkey is can be very disruptive to especially for the on-call person. Especially if the systems are not all prepared for a Chaos Monkey kind of situation. It's no surprise that we won a large monolithic database, and a Chaos Monkey killing our large monolithic database would be pretty
painful.
Yeah.
Painful.
Yeah, painful. That's the word.
Yeah.
Terrible, like all those things.
So
on the Spot instance thing, to show for myself, I wrote a blog post on this recently on the Signal versus Noise blog, on like how we run Spot instances, run them well. So
plug.
So there was a question: how did our first comms test go? And the truth is, it went horribly. And it was probably good that it didn't go very well, because it caused us to look at other tooling. So we did our first comms test after we had migrated our status page to do statuspage.io. And it was we were using their SMS infrastructure, and not everyone was getting the SMSs. And that was when we decided to change to using PagerDuty, which we've used PagerDuty for probably 8 or 9 years, pretty much as long as PagerDuty existed. Never had any issues with SMS deliverability. So that was why we decided to switch things to PagerDuty, and things have been much better. So PagerDuty, that discount come anytime now.
Let's see. So there was another thread here about how we keep track of IP reputation, maybe just general about anti-abuse, and you could talk a little bit about that. So we do use some block lists that we integrate into our inbound mail pipeline. We also mentioned sort of some of the RSpamD, ClamIV tools that we use to sort of filter and watch. We have also built some of our own capabilities for managing and detecting sort of abuse from IPs into the apps. So we have ways where we can essentially block IPs on the fly as we detect problems as they happen within the applications themselves. And that we have those both in the cloud and sort of for our on-prem apps. And so far we've not found anything that's sort of external that works better for those. I think there is some looking that we're doing about whether or not we should be using some commercial tools for more of the email reputation, both inbound and outbound pieces that we're trying to kind of understand how those work and how those fit with where to. But today we're using purely open source, and then Nathan sort of alluded to a lot of monitoring that we do. So we We monitor all of our DMARC reports, all of our MTA/STS configurations and settings. We have active our own sort of monitoring network that we've built up to a lot of providers, where we're sending emails out periodically from every one of our outbound servers to every one of our email clients, and detecting when things start going to spam or don't arrive. So really, it's a pretty wide range of monitoring tools that we have in place, and we keep adding new ones as we detect various attacks and things that we haven't seen from running other kinds of services before. So that's kind of a quick overview of some of those components.
Yeah.
And
I will add that, and there's one of the other questions was asking about auto scaling as well. But all of our monitoring, our blocking functionality, and our scaling functionality, those are all manual actions for us. We are monitoring things. We have systems monitoring things in real time, and they will alert. But the decision on whether or not we need to scale up, more front end capacity, that's a human decision, and that's a human action. We don't have that hooked up into any sort of automated system yet. And same with most of our blocking. We do have some auto blocking for some actions on our legacy apps, but mainly those are human-driven actions.
I think on auto scaling too, the other thing that you have to worry about is that auto scaling is historically like an after action or an after the fact action. Like if you're scaling on some metric, whether it's response time or CPU load, like you end up scaling after something has already happened, whether you've gone above a threshold or the app is down and not responding because it's overloaded. And like, we'd rather just be prepared and have enough capacity scaled up beforehand rather than having to do that. The other piece is like, the Basecamp apps, that fleet of apps, has historically had a very standardized traffic pattern where during the work week, we know when the peaks in traffic are. With something like Hey, we didn't necessarily know going in what the traffic peaks, how it would ebb and flow. And we do now. So we do have more data to back up auto scaling decisions, but it's just not something that we've gotten around to doing yet.
go ahead.
There were also some questions in here about infrastructure as code. We use Terraform a lot, as much as I don't like it sometimes. It works relatively well for the things that we use it for. Prior apps that we've run on AWS have been a lot more Terraform dependent, going so far as to like apps that we run in ECS. They deploy through Terraform, through a Terraform module. With Hey, we don't do that. We use Terraform to create infrastructure, but we don't use it to actively deploy to that infrastructure beyond then. And with CloudFormation, we also end up using CloudFormation too, because we use EKS-CTL to manage some of our clusters for now, with the goal of moving away from that to some Terraform-driven stuff, just to gain some extra functionality that we don't have now. Like the big one is that we need to add more IP address subnets to our clusters, and EKS-CTL only has a concept of one subnet per AZ per cluster. Whereas if we use Terraform, we can kind of get around that a bit.
Yeah, I think
and then
that actually sparks a story. Somebody mentioned they loved war stories. I think I promised somebody on Twitter a while back that I would tell at least one war story from the deployment days. But we discovered as we're launching up for this ramp, and we're sort of freaking out about how much, what's going to look like to have 200,000 users on the system, when we realized that our VPC in AWS is provisioned with probably enough IPs, but not enough to feel like we had unlimited room to scale all of our pods, and because Kubernetes eats up lots of IPs beyond just what you have for the nodes. So we start looking at all the different ways to add IPs. We figure out our EKS-CTL won't support it, and then we decide that we need to actually like double the size of all the pods on the cluster, and then deploy half as many of them, and that'll save a bunch of IP space, just to give us some headroom. So I launched into this project, I think right in the first week of launch. When Saturday we figure out we're going to go all the way, so I decide, Monday morning before we launch all this stuff, I need to get this new thing out the door, because I'd hate for it to cause a problem after we launch. So I think an hour before David tweets that the gates are open and we're like going to launch all this stuff, I push this change, and immediately PagerDuty goes off, which is, as anybody knows, is the worst feeling in the world, is when you just hit deploy and then PagerDuty slams you. And it turns out that one of the things we figured out is that we had too low a pod disruption budget set on all of our primary apps. And so what we were essentially doing was deploying a new environment that was going to be half the number of pods. And with a 50% pod disruption budget, it essentially meant that we allowed Kubernetes to go to 1/4 of the number of pods that we had running while we're spinning this environment up, which essentially took the entire app down. It was a relatively quick revert and fix, and it wasn't down for a long time. And it was, we took it as a good learning lesson. But I'll tell you, I was sort of licking my wounds for a couple hours after, like, yes, who's the guy who took down Hay on launch day? And I also tell that story because we do have those here. I mean, we talk a lot about all the successes and how much better Hay was than wasn't. But I also think we realize we push the envelope here. Sometimes we're going to have mistakes. We learn from them. We recover. We move forward a little bit more carefully. And I can also tell you that I didn't feel bad because anybody else made me feel bad. I think everybody in the company, from support, through David, everybody else was, absolutely understood. We were pushing the envelope, and those things happened. And, it's a side effect of part of the learning process that we go through. And so that was, definitely fits into what would I have done differently? I would have had a VP. First of all, I'd have had a VPC with a lot more IP address space because it was all 1918 space. We completely control it. This was, sort of something we just didn't think to check the box on before we launched. And then, secondly, we would have made some of those changes a little bit earlier in the process. But the good news is we still have the opportunity to go back and do some of that. So
there was a related question here about did we hit the IP per instance limit EKS? And we haven't yet. We run pretty small nodes. By small, like I think we're on 2x large instances right now, and we don't bin pack them tightly enough to where we have 20 pods on a node. I'd say we're probably running 10 or 15 on any given node at a time.
I would actually say probably even lower than that, but okay. we have very large pods. I mean, I think also compared to other environments that I've been in, we have pods that are allocated to like 2 to 4 cores, and a similar amount.
It's not Go. It's not Go where we can give a pod 128 megabytes of RAM and say, go on your way. Ruby will literally fall over.
Yeah. Yes. And so we have not hit that problem. And it also gives us some more flexibility in terms of how we attack the IP management problem, which we're doing pretty well with.
I saw that Fargate question too. The reason we don't use Fargate yet is because there is no Fargate for Spot for EKS. There's Fargate for Spot with ECS. But there's a break-even point with Fargate when you're not running on Spot, and it's not. Sorry, there's a break-even point with Fargate when you're not running your regular instances on Spot, and it's just not there yet for us.
I wanted to address a couple really quick. How do you spin up infrastructure quickly? They mentioned earlier Terraform for some of the base infrastructure stuff, but as far as scaling our front end, we use Helm charts and CI/CD. We use BuildKite for that, and most of those changes are pushed out through BuildKite with Helm. And someone followed up with, would you still consider auto scaling even though it's reactive? And if you're talking about auto scaling in the reactive form, I would really never consider it. Now, if Kubernetes had a scheduled auto scaling where I could say, at like a cron schedule, like scale up to this many pods or to this size at a given time on a schedule, I'd absolutely look at that. That would be amazing. I know there's a couple controllers out there. I think Blake's probably looking them up right now that will let us do that. We just haven't had the time to look into them. But something with a predictive traffic pattern where we can scale up on a schedule and scale down on a schedule, I would absolutely be behind that.
And I think as time goes on with the launch of Hay, our traffic is only going to get more and more predictive over time. We've already had that huge kind of launch rush. And I think it may make sense to do that more in the future than it did at launch time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of those kind of things that we're trying to really sort through. I know I've spent a lot of time this week really trying to understand limits and requests for pod sizes, how that balances out to how we're stacking and mapping because we have our pod structure doesn't match well to the physical structure, so we're like over allocating CPUs and underusing memory, all of which we have guesses from our load testing. But now that we're getting some real world examples, we're spending a lot of time looking at those, and there's even been some discussion about like the idea of maybe using vertical pod auto scaling to manage around some of those limits sizing on particular pods as we sort of dial some of this in and don't. Because I think that's part of the issue now is like we've had such a great launch and a great experience. How do we start ratcheting things down to get more efficient, but not risk compromising the user experience just to sort of save a buck on the back end? And that's a challenging piece, which also I think goes into some of the questions about how do we decide, how do we decide whether to use a managed service versus an unmanaged service? How do we decide whether to be on-prem versus the cloud? I mean, those are honestly ongoing discussions across the board. I think we're looking, I would say right now, both at Aurora and Elasticache to try to figure out in the long run, does it make sense for us to be on those highly managed sort of database type services versus say Redis on EC2 instances on our own, at least for certain places where maybe replication isn't as important. But we have to trade that off between just the time. I mean, we're a 7-person team right now, looking to go to like 9 to 10 in the next few months. And so there's a big balance between the things we could do. We were even having a discussion, around even where do we like locking in some of the stuff on reserved instances where we have some undecided things about maybe how we're doing caching. Should we use Redis or MySQL for this one thing? And if we lock in a Redis, long-term Redis commit, does that prevent us from getting something that might be cheaper? Well, if you're looking at, on the top of it, you go, well, it's $3,000 a month. But if you look at that as opposed to, percentage of an engineer's time, might be better to just lock that in and pay a little bit more and spend time on optimizing our abuse pipeline or getting Vitesse out the door and helping with scaling. So I think it's really a constant set of discussions. And the good news is it's across the entire team. I think like nothing I'm sitting here talking about as the kind of lead for the group is some plan that I've got that I'm off in the back room discussing and handing down. It's an ongoing set of discussions on Basecamp every day amongst all of us about, where we should be spending our time. And we do that in, very, I would say not exactly the same way the Shape Up book talks about. It's not as ops is a little more on demand. Even us like doing this in 6 weeks increments, we get surprised with things that just have to be done in the middle. But we try to think in that same window of time, like what are a set of things we'd like to tackle in the next 6 weeks? And there's a long list of things that just won't fit in that will just be on the table. And some that we may never get to. We've got some systems running on ECS that we'd love to have running on Kubernetes instead, just for consistency. But that's just not been enough of a priority to shift all of those. One of them was a priority for some reasons of providing resilience and some other ones. So we moved one of those older apps, and we'd like to, I guess not to Kubernetes yet. We just split it multi-region, but we want to look at, some other things like that. So, but we look at those, it's almost an evolved Kanban style of I guess work, in the sense that we're still very interrupt driven and we take it as we come, but we try to pick off some things in kind of these 6 week chunks that sort of say, well, here's some things we'd like to get done in this window, and then a bunch of things that we just can't, we know we can't touch. So
I think that's applicable to the question about reducing Ruby app requirements to decrease pod size. That was something we talked about recently, was whether we wanted to reduce request count or did we just want to cut the number of pods? Well, that kind of dilemma. And the return of trying to decrease the Ruby performance requirements are vastly different than those of just fixing the pod requirements. And from the engineering time, like changing resizing pods to decrease the number of pods is a significantly cheaper outcome than spending hours and hours of engineering time trying to nitpick Ruby performance things. And so it again falls back to what do we actually have time to do? What's the priority?
Yeah, and I think, for instance, we get much more mileage from the same set of resources by optimizing some of the database backend stuff and less on the front end stuff. And even from our cost profile, because of the work we've done to take advantage of spot nodes and other things, the front end costs, are also probably less return for us to optimize around the details of, because the cost of the spot instance just isn't that high. So there's a lot of mechanics, I guess, that go in, and some that are very unique to Basecamp. You have to understand about just the way that we do things, where we have resources available, but always good conversations, and always sort of that stuff is on the table. Well, I think, look, we're a little over an hour, so I think to leave some room for the next one of these, we'll probably wrap it up. But just to go around the room real quick, John, you got any last thoughts or other things you want to share with folks before we sign off? You probably need some volume on. There you go.
There's actually one question there that I thought was a pretty good one about the team being generalists or specialists, and I would say that we kind of are a blend. Everyone is expected to be a generalist, and certainly a generalist when you're kind of on call and dealing with issues. But every person on the team, and certainly more senior people on the team, are I guess expected to be a specialist in some part of our infrastructure, be that storage or AWS or Terraform or whatever it may be. Everybody can kind of, pick something that they want to be, that is of interest to them, or that we need their interest in, and kind of dive into that deeper than I think a normal generalist position would lend you the ability to do.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think as the team grows a bit, and with the focus on sort of two very popular, very high profile apps with Basecamp and Hey at the same time, we are thinking about maybe a way where people get a little more focused. But, for instance, Blake spends a lot of his time in the tooling for deployment and rollout and sort of the underlying infrastructure of Kubernetes. Nathan has been super deep on logging, and also helping out a lot on the build pipeline. John's working a lot on our resiliency and failover capabilities. So I think everybody's got a place. But the nice thing is too, when Blake got kind of sick of deploying things on Kubernetes, he could also go deep on something else for a few weeks, which so I think a lot of that specialist generalist is driven by the individual and what they want to do here and where they want to spend their time. And we do have, for a small team, a lot of ability to range across that landscape.
Right. And just actually, this question just came in as a follow-up. Yes, there's absolutely room for more than one person to be a specialist on something. I would argue that Blake and I equally love our build pipeline. It's just something we both find extremely interesting, and we both have complementing skill sets when it comes to it. And we're both, equally deep into it. It's really, it's just, there's a lot of space, here. So it's definitely not, oh, John's our LDAP expert, so no one else can touch LDAP. I mean, we all choose not to touch LDAP, but we could if we wanted to. So,
well, I think we've made a lot of strides in also documenting a lot of common situations to help with that whole on-call process, so that you don't have to have everything for every system off the top of your head. I think that's, while there is a generalist in terms of being comfortable going wide ranging, we also, are trying to get to the point where, in fact, we were just having a discussion today about how to update some of our internal alerting tools to give you more pinpointed instructions for handling specific types of issues and errors, so that there's less of that you have to figure out. And I would also say there's an expectation generally that if you're on call, not that you can fix everything that happens, that your responsibility is to just be able to triage and realize when to call in help, when to escalate bigger issues, and maybe when things just need to be tuned a little bit better from an alarming standpoint. We don't see that as something where everybody's got to be able to handle every situation. And I will tell you, just from firsthand experience, our expectation is the people that come in are going to take a few months to get comfortable and sort of contribute at a high level. And we always love to be surprised by that, but there's a lot to learn just about how to make your way around the environment. And we're very cognizant that we have a huge role to play in getting people up to speed on that, and people being successful in that environment after they get here, and that's probably going to take some time and something that we want to invest in for everybody. Blake, any final thoughts before we put a wrap on this one?
I think on the cloud side, it's totally worth getting comfortable with the people that are supporting you at the cloud organizations that you're using. I know we're really close with our AWS account team, and that's been super useful for us in terms of getting in touch with product teams when we need to figure out how something works or why something doesn't work that way, or stuff with pricing. And there's just so many facets that you gain from being close to the people who built the products that you build on top of, that I think it's something that people should not doubt and negate.
Good stuff. Yeah, I think that's, if you're going to be in the cloud, you need to be in the cloud. You need to take advantage of the people that are running there, and I think of the services that are there too. So, all right. Well, I think we're at 1:10. I'm sure we could keep going. I know I can talk for a long time, but it turns out there's probably some other things I need to be doing. So let this wrap up. I appreciate everybody's question and the engagement that we had. I'll also tell you that one of the reasons we did this again was some people started bugging us about when we do another one. So feel free to reach out to us on Twitter or other places if you want to see these. We love to do them, but we're not necessarily proactive about putting ourselves out there. So I'll give you permission to bug us a little bit if you want to see some of this stuff written up in blog posts or other things. Blake's been pretty good at that. I know I could be a little better, but I think we have some stuff coming out about Prometheus and our monitoring pipeline, and some other pieces that'll be coming out around some of that stuff. So anyway, thanks a lot for everybody joining us today. Thanks to Blake, Nathan, and John for putting up with all my questions. And anyway, we'll look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Thanks a lot.